All right, next up in the office remodel is a new desk, and I didn't even mess with anything to show you guys on the video. This is just the normal state of my desk. Most all this crap will go elsewhere, but in this video we're going to focus on remaking this desk. I love it, but it can be better, so let me show you why. This is the woodgears.ca wheelie desk. I made it all out of hickory with a little bit of plywood and walnut on top. But basically, it's a desk or a cart that you can move anywhere you want. I'm using it for my computer, obviously, and put my a little platform in the back for the computer. I want to take this concept and make it just a little bit more convenient, and for that, we're just going to use a sit-stand electronic uplift desk platform. And also, one of the biggest concerns for me is I still need this thing on wheels. And while this is a small space, I'm not going to be moving this throughout my house. I do have 4 dogs. They sleep in my office, and anybody who has dogs knows that there's just an endless supply of dog hair. So having this where I can roll it out, sweep behind it very easily on an almost daily basis, that's actually something that I need. So before we get started with making the top for the new uplift desk base, let's just go in the shop and build the uplift platform so I can figure out exactly what I need for the top. Third floor, lingerie, ding, ding, ding. Right on. So I wanted to assemble everything and make sure all the components are working, but also make sure I had the spacing correct for the top. I didn't want to build my top too narrow for the smallest width of the desk. What I picked out for the top is Bobinga, and I have 3 boards here. This big board in the middle is what I was hoping to get the entire tabletop out of, just for grain consistency and of course color consistency. But I have another piece of Bobinga, oh man, back here, and this stuff is so heavy. And then another one over here, and some more in my shed for storage for other projects. But so I've got plenty to mix and match. The question is, can I get everything out of this board? So time to mill some Bobinga. One concern I do have with this piece of Bobinga is all of these surface checks. Now, it's not just here at the end. It goes all the way through and all the way down the board. There's just a lot of little bit of cracks, and I'm not sure if that'll affect the project, but as far as the visuals go, but I think I am going to have to come back and fill all of these as best I can with some epoxy, and that way it'll make this piece of Bobinga a lot more stable. The first step in milling all of this Bobinga is to cross-cut it at my miter saw station. These pieces of Bobinga have a little bit of a twist to them, and they're too wide for my jointer. So I'm going to make a rough ripping cut first at the bandsaw. And the reason I'm using the bandsaw and not the table saw is because there is a little bit of a twist, and because they don't stay flat on the table saw surface, there might be some shifting involved at the end of the cut, and I don't want them to shift into the table saw blade. It's much less of a dramatic scene if they shift into a bandsaw blade rather than a table saw blade. Next up, the Bobinga gets jointed at the jointer. These pieces are right off the jointer facing up, jointed side facing up, and I wanted to get a good feel for the colors because I was going to mix 2 of these boards to get the tabletop together, but I don't think I'm going to do that because the other board that I have picked out already it's just not a good color match. This is more brown, these are more deeper red boards, so this is going to be okay. I'll use this for some trim on some other pieces in the same room. This on the other side of the room will be just fine. However, inside the exact same panel for the top of the desk, it's obviously noticeable that it's a different color. So we'll set this aside, and I'll just work with this for the top, but I need about this much width for the tabletop. So what I need to do is resaw every single one of these right down the middle. They are all 2 inches, maybe a little bit heavy of 2 inches thick, which is great because this should give me 2 pieces that I should have no problems milling these 2 halves down to a final thickness of 3/4 of an inch, or maybe a little bit thicker than that. After resawing at the bandsaw, we ended up with 8 boards to use for the tabletop, and I only need 6, so I'm going to set 2 of these aside that are a little bit thin from resawing. They're still more than 3/4 of an inch, but all of these, except this one, are down to about 7/8 of an inch, so I can run these through once more to get rid of all this and be right at 3/4 of an inch. Actually, I could probably just flip this upside down and maintain a thicker tabletop, just put that in the back on bottom. I may or may not do that, I'm not sure. But what I have here is more than enough for the width. I'm going for about 28 inches, maybe a little bit less than that, which means I need 6 pieces that are around 4 3/4 of an inch. All of that can change just a little bit. Well, what I want to do now is every one of these has one really good straight edge that was jointed at the jointer, so I'll use that up against the fence on the table saw to rip all of these at their maximum width. It's okay if they're off just by a slight amount, one from the next, because it's not really going to be noticeable if, say, one of these is 4 3/4 of an inch, one is 4 5/8, and the next one is 4 7/8. It's not going to be noticeable. I'm going for maximum yield here. I have all of my pieces cut to their final width. They are just a tiny bit oversized, and that's because I want to finesse these joints. But I have them oriented in the final glue up direction, and I used a highly visible marking device, in this case just a yellow crayon, to mark a carpenter's triangle on the top so I know they go back in the exact same orientation. Now what we need to do is really make sure that this joint is just absolutely perfect. Now you can just set your fence on your jointer to 90 degrees, joint one edge, glue it together, and you pretty much should be all right. But you can get better than that, and that is by canceling out any type of error that your jointer fence may be. And what I mean is, let's just say that you set your jointer fence to what you think is 90 degrees, but in actuality it's actually just, let's just say, a half a degree out. I'll exaggerate that half a degree error with this blue tape, and we'll do it on opposite pieces of this joint like so. And in this orientation, what we did is we used the top surface of both of these boards up against the fence to joint to this edge. And if the jointer is out by just a tiny amount, like I said, what you will end up with is 2 opposite angles like this. You clamp the boards together, and then the clamps will pull the faces so that they're parallel. In this case, again, exaggerated, but your panel won't be dead, absolutely perfectly flat. So what we want to do is put one side up against the fence. I'll put an X over here. And then on the other board, the other part of the joint, you put the opposite side up against the fence. So I'll put an X over here. And what that does is it makes your angles, or your error, whatever error your fence may have, again, we're assuming it's at 90 degrees, whatever error it is will be, they'll cancel each other out, and this joint will be just absolutely perfect. So I'm going to go through and mark the opposite faces of every one of my joints, and then run these through the jointer once more to remove just a tiny amount. To help keep all of the pieces aligned during the glue up, we used number 10 biscuits. Quite a few of them actually, and between the biscuits and having all of the clamps adjusted and ready to go, the glue up was pretty uneventful, which is exactly what you want with a glue up. The center 2 boards are actually a book matched pair that unfortunately had a crack in the board before we resawed it. Now this means that both pieces have a crack and they both need to be filled. Now I thought I had some slow set epoxy on hand, but as it turned out, I didn't. So we used 5-minute epoxy and heated it up slightly to make it a little bit more runny, which is probably not the best thing to do, but it worked. And to get more of the epoxy into the crack, I had Jeremy use a shop vac on the bottom surface to suck as much of the epoxy into the joint as possible. And because I was working with fast set epoxy, it just wasn't the prettiest job, but like I said, it worked. The next day I used a heat gun to slightly warm the cured epoxy, and then a plain blade with a push stick to kind of pare away the epoxy, similar to the way you'd use a chisel on the surface of the wood, and this actually worked surprisingly well. Because the panel is wider than my table saw crosscut sled, I used a straight edge and a circular saw to square off one end. And as you can see, I'm just not a big fan of tools without dust collection. First I tried a shop vac to kind of just hold it in place and suck up as much of the dust. That didn't work, but I quickly realized I needed to put the mask on because this thing was just spraying dust everywhere. And that's kind of a characteristic of a handheld circular saw, any one of them really. It's not brand specific, but this really makes me want to get a track saw with integrated dust collection sooner rather than later. Then the panel can be easily cut to length with the table saw. So Babinga is a really hard wood, which made sanding just incredibly difficult, even on like 60 grit. So to remove the bulk of the material, which is kind of what you should do anyway with a panel like this, I started with a cabinet scraper and then a card scraper. And then once I had the majority of the smoothing done with those two tools, I switched over to 180 grit sandpaper in my random orbit sander, just to make sure that the entire surface area was even. Part of me wanted to leave a square corner appearance to the desk because I tend to like straight lines, sharp corners, more so than curves and radiuses. But I figured it would be best to round over the corners because it's going to be in my office. It's kind of a tight space, and I will be interacting with this more so than anything else in my office. So to do that, I used a homemade radiusing jig that was cut out on a friend's CNC machine, so I know it's a perfect radius. And it's just a piece of plywood with 2 plywood stops glued and nailed to the side of it, and that'll hook over the corner. And after multiple light passes with a flush trim router bit, the CNC radius is therefore transferred into the Babinga panel. Every time that I use this particular tool, I get questions about the dust collection, so here we go real quick. This is a Bosch Colt router with the factory edge guide attachment and a shop vac attachment kind of hacked up and hot glued to the fence. And it's not pretty at all, but the dust collection that it provides is fantastic. To break the edges slightly, I used a 1/2 inch roundover bit and set the depth so that it wouldn't cut a full roundover. Instead, with the profile cut from both the top and bottom of the panel, I was left with a really nice bowl nose of profile, just a subtle rounded curve on that otherwise flat face. For a finish, I'm using a water-based polyurethane, and anytime you use a water-based finish, you should always use a damp rag to raise the grain first. And this is because if you don't do this, then when you apply the finish that has water in it, it will raise the grain and it will make your finish fuzzy and not smooth. So instead, you raise the grain first and then knock it back down with some fine sandpaper. But I left this clip in real time so you could see how much air circulation I have with my air cleaner cart here in the shop. The thing moves a tremendous amount of air, and as you can see, the water dries really fast, which means that when I apply the finish, it's going to dry really fast as well. So with the grain already raised and fuzzy, a single pass with 320 grit sandpaper in my sander will get rid of the raised grain. Finally, I'm ready to apply the finish, and this step was actually pretty exciting for me. In the previous 2 projects for my office remodel, I used a solvent-based lacquer that just really stunk up my shop and my house for days. And in this case, I was able to spray the water-based poly inside and not worry about any crazy fumes, and also not worry about the weather playing into whether I can or cannot apply a finish. I ended up spraying just 2 coats because I think I sprayed the first coat on just a little bit too thick. Installing the desk hardware is pretty straightforward, nothing crazy. First, the legs are secured to the panel through mounting slots. Then the keyboard rail is installed the exact same way. Once the keyboard tray is added, the shipping locking pin can be removed. A bump stop is added to prevent the keyboard tray from sliding out of the track. And the power brick, it should have been installed before this point, before the keyboard rail, but I was able to slide it underneath the rail and secure it with a screw. And then finally, I installed the button and memory pad about 1/2 of an inch from the front edge. The rest of the items, those can be added when the desk is in place. I will say that this desk ended up being pretty heavy, and I have no idea how much it weighs, but it was a little nerve-wracking bringing it in to the office by myself, but you know, I was just too excited to get it in place, so there was no way I was going to wait for an extra set of hands. I did it by myself, but I probably should have had somebody helping me. So it's been about 4 days since I installed this desk here in my office, and as much as I do computer work, this is something that I should have done a long time ago. I'm very familiar with the benefits of standing while working, and I'm very familiar with how your body just naturally slows down for long periods of sitting down while working. So I've made standing desks in the past. I've made several rolling computer desks or stationary computer desks in the past where you sit down. And the problem with all of those is I've never made it convenient to switch between the two. So all of my sit-down desks, I never really had a convenient way to stand up and work on those at the same time. And all of my standing desks, I never really had a convenient way to sit down and rest while working. They've all been stationary desks. This obviously fits both of those situations because it is a stand-up, sit-down desk. This is an uplift desk, and if I want to sit down, I can obviously sit down and work, but if I want to stand up, I can hit the button and get to a nice standing position that keeps me more active and keeps me working rather than sitting down and slowing down. When it comes to these stand-up, sit-down desks, you can obviously buy the entire kit with a top, assemble it, and just be on your way. I wanted the frame without the top, that way I could make the top and add a little bit of a personal touch, and I went with Babinga, as I've already said before. That's just such a fun word to say. I'm super happy with the way that this turned out. It's gorgeous. This fluorescent light here in my shop, or in my office, isn't doing the color justice right here. But I'm very pleased with the way that this panel turned out. So, like I said, this is an uplift desk frame, and this video isn't sponsored by Uplift Desk, but I did do my market research and determine the frame that I would like to build upon. I contacted upliftdesk.com and asked if they would share some product in exchange for marketing. So, with that being said, I want to go over a few of the features here that make this desk really awesome for me. When it comes to the keyboard, I definitely wanted one of these pull-out trays because I'm not a fan at all of putting the keyboard on top of the work surface or the desk surface. The reason being is I'm a huge list person, and this is where I want to keep my lists. I normally have one for immediate tasks, another list for long-term ideas, and then also a monthly planner, because if it's not on the list, if it's not on the planner, it just doesn't get done. So having those three items right in front of me at all times is very nice. So the keyboard tray is also very nice. It has quite a bit of range of motion, actually more than what I need. I should have used the smaller tray or smaller track rather than the longer one, because if I push this all the way in, this is kind of visible. Not that big of a deal, but this wouldn't be here if I used the shorter track. But the tray is highly adjustable. You just pull up on the front side and you can change the elevation all the way down to there's a little gauge over here that says number 5 is all the way down, maybe 5 inches or so, but you can go all the way up into a negative value, so you're kind of at the same height of your work surface. So that is really easily adjusted, and I keep mine normally around 2, but there's also another dial right here where you can adjust the angle to really dial in the most ergonomic and comfortable position for you. For me, and for this keyboard, I keep this at a slight negative angle or an increased angle on the front side so that it's about 4 or 5 degrees, and that's just most comfortable for me. One absolute must for me is whatever computer desk I have, it has to be mobile. Just like the last one, this one has casters down below, and it doesn't need to be mobile because I need to move it around too far. It needs to be mobile because I've got 4 dogs. They sleep in my office. It's just the most fitting room in the house for the dogs to be in. And anybody who has animals, dogs in particular, knows that there's an endless supply of dog hair. It's kind of frustrating, but it is what it is. So for me, I have to be able to slide this out on a pretty much daily basis so I can sweep behind it and then push it back as needed. So even though I'm not going too far, mobility for me is an absolute must. The monitor I'm using is a 27-inch 4K monitor, and it's not the lightest monitor there is, but this stand handles it no problem. What's cool about this is there's a wire tray or wire trough inside the monitor arm, so this moves as needed with the wires and gives you a good range of motion without sacrificing some ugly cable management. And there's 2 different mounting options. You can drill it through your desk, or in my case, I just use the clamping base option. There are some clips back here at the bottom of the monitor stand to hold some of the wires, which goes into this wire management trough. And this may look like a little bit of chaos on the back side, but that's okay because on the front, all of this is concealed. You won't even see it. And it puts all of the wires in a nice convenient location. Inside here is actually one of these power strips. And coming out of this hole over here is the main power for the power strip, as well as my monitor wire and one dedicated USB wire. to power this whole station. So all of this goes through this, this sleeve type material all the way up to the wall. This little memory panel is obviously how you raise and lower the desk. So you just hold it down for the arrows if you want the arrows. Or in my case, number 2 is my standing position, which I think I just went back to. But if you want to program another one, you just hit memory 4. And now the 4th spot is programmed to that height. So if I want to sit down, obviously, there you go. So over the past 4 days, I've found that I like to stand up the vast majority of the time, probably 90% of the time. But when it comes to taking a little bit off your feet, it's very easy to kick the anti-fatigue mat underneath the desk, go to the sit-down position, and use this little gem. This is the motion stool that they sent as well. And quite honestly, when he said he wanted to send this with it, I was kind of like, meh, okay. But as you can tell, I've gotten rid of my computer chair because this thing is awesome. It's a stool. It's a very, very padded and comfortable stool, but it kind of allows you to pivot around slightly instead of rolling. And then also it promotes good posture. You're forced to sit up. So this was an unexpected huge thumbs up, and I'm probably going to get another one for Jeremy because he's here in the shop or in the office editing with me. So I think that's it for this particular project. I've got to get to work finishing editing this video. Huge thanks to Uplift Desk for providing the base for this project. The Bobinga, like I said, turned out fantastic, and I'm going to put a lot of miles on this desk setup. You guys take care, have a great day, and I'll talk to you in the next video.